Okay.
Me?
Yes.
That's you.
Okay. I'm Louisa Hodges, and my report is brief. For our chapter 1017, we started out the month with $1,050.23. We picked up one new member, and our total at the end of the month was $1,070.23. So we're in an okay place. We could be better. I encourage anyone else who's visiting our meeting to consider joining. And Mohammed has posted the mailing address, so feel free to join.
Yeah, you might tell them how much it is for a year.
It's $20 for individual, and it's $30 for family. And let's see, I don't have, what is it for the student? I've just forgotten.
15.
It's very reasonable. We go January to January.
Right.
That's it. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Louisa. So today's speaker is Jane Ackland. Jane is the current Gender Sexuality Identity Program Coordinator at Amnesty International USA. And as a program coordinator, she works on reproductive rights, LGBTI rights, and Indigenous right advocacy in the United States. And the title of her presentation today is The Never-Ending Maze: Continued Failure to Protect Indigenous Women from Sexual Violence in the USA. So please join me in welcoming Jane to our meeting. Go ahead, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I will share my screen shortly. Let me just get this figured out. Love Zoom. So let's see, share screen, presentation, share. Oh, we'll have to do that thing where you switch I'll have to stop share and then switch the display, swap presenter and slideshow. Let me see. I was just able to do it. Gosh, I just did this about 15 minutes ago. So share, swap presenter and slide. Let me see. Are you looking at just my screen, or are you looking at the notes on the side with the timer?
Just the screen.
Screen.
No.
Oh, it's just the screen and there's nothing on the right side?
Right. No.
Right.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you again so much for the introduction. So I will be telling you a little bit about Amnesty International USA's new report, The Never-Ending Maze: Continued Failure to Protect Indigenous Women from Sexual Violence in the USA. So just to give you a little bit of an overview, let me see. To give you a little bit of an overview, so The Never-Ending Maze is actually an update to a 2007 report called Maze of Injustice. So that is a report that helped to really sort of spread awareness about sexual violence against Indigenous women in the United States. And in the past 15 years, there have been some steps taken to address this issue, but the government response has still been quite inadequate, and American Indian and Alaska Native women, or AIAN women, as I will refer to them throughout the presentation, still face extremely high rates of sexual violence in the US. And they face some of the highest rates in general, and statistics have shown that there hasn't really been a huge change in the statistics in the past 15 years. So just to give you a little bit of a brief statistical overview, so 56.1% of AIAN women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. So that's a little bit more than 1 in 2. 1 in 3 AIAN women, or Indigenous, I'll use those two terms interchangeably if it's easier. 1 in 3 Indigenous women have been raped in their lifetime, and are 2.2 times more likely to be raped than non-Hispanic white women. So again, these statistics are incredibly shocking, but they aren't that different from the data that was shared in the original Maze report about 15 years ago. And it is widely believed essentially that the data that is available doesn't provide the full sort of picture or provide the full scope of the issue, as the US government does not consistently collect data on sexual violence against Indigenous women in the US. And anecdotal evidence that we have collected from the dozens of Indigenous advocates we interviewed for the report actually suggests that the rates of sexual violence are much worse than a lot of data sort of shows, I would say. So that is just kind of a brief statistical overview of some of the findings in the report. And I'm going to tell you in this report, or in this presentation, I'm going to tell you about some of the main chapters that are presented in the report. So in general, the rates of violence against Indigenous women stem from the US eroding tribal government authority and essentially refusing to untangle this jurisdictional maze. And I keep using the word maze. We will get to that, and I'll explain that further when we talk about the jurisdiction chapter. There's also a policing chapter, a healthcare and support services chapter, and a prosecutions chapter. So these are the 4 topics that I will be diving into today during my presentation. But before we get to some of these major issues outlined in the report, we start out with a chapter called Legacy of the Past that describes how violence against Indigenous women is a part of history, but sexual violence is also a continued reality of systemic violence against Indigenous peoples in the United States. And violence against Indigenous women has occurred for hundreds of years. It first started when European colonizers forcibly relocated Indigenous peoples and committed widespread atrocities in the process, including, things like disease and starvation, killing large portions of the Indigenous peoples in the United States. But again, this is not just a part of the distant past. In more modern times, and some things that perhaps you have heard of as well in the news. So in the past, we had boarding schools in the United States where forced assimilation took place, primarily in the 1900s, where Indigenous children suffered many forms of violence, so physical, emotional, and sexual violence at the hands of employees and staff of these boarding schools. Children were forced to learn in English. They could only speak English. They were removed from their families, so they were essentially stripped of their traditional languages and their families and their tribes' cultures by being put in these schools to be assimilated. And then also there's the issue of sexual abuse at the hands of Indian Health Service doctors, or IHS, which is the federal health agency that is specifically for Indigenous peoples in the United States. And so there has been many different forms of abuse at the hands of IHS doctors, including like coerced sterilization. And also many women have suffered sexual abuse at the hands of doctors. And there have been some high profile cases that have come out in the press in the past decade or so, where several doctors have been able to perpetrate sexual violence for many, many years while working at Indian Health Service hospitals. So that is just kind of, the past and the present sort of status of violence against Indigenous women in general in the United States. So I'm going to tell you a little bit as well about international and US federal law. So there's been, as I mentioned before, the sort of deliberate degradation of tribal sovereignty by the US government, which has worsened the pandemic, or the epidemic rather, of sexual violence. The epidemic of sexual violence against Indigenous women. And really at the root of this is discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and the failure to respect the rights of Indigenous people has led to high rates of violence. And the US also has a federal trust responsibility to Indigenous peoples in the US. And you might be wondering, like, what is that? So it's really the legal relationship that exists between the US federal government and tribes. And it is a unique relationship which places on the government sort of the obligation to ensure the protection of the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples, but they do not fully respect or honor this responsibility. And this report is really getting into all of the ways in which the government has failed to protect Indigenous women. They do not uphold the responsibility. So I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the human rights that are at stake when the US fails to adequately prevent and respond to sexual violence against Indigenous women. These are just a few. So to live free from violence, for example, or to have the right to the high sustainable standard of physical and mental health. I also want to tell you a little bit about the rights that are specific to Indigenous peoples as well under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or just UNDRIP, because it's a very long name. There are lots of acronyms in the report as well. So these rights are quite unique because Indigenous peoples are the only peoples to have such sort of designated collective rights. So like the rights to self-determination, autonomy, self-government, and very importantly, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions. And so then to tell you about the jurisdictional maze. So the US has this very complicated relationship between federal, state, and tribal jurisdiction that really undermines tribal authority, and Congress has just produced a lot of laws that are in dire need of complete reform in the United States. And so there are three main factors that determine where jurisdictional authority lies. So whether the victim is recognized as an Indian under federal law, whether the accused is recognized as an Indian under federal law, and whether the alleged offense took place in Indian country. So there can be a lot of confusion about boundaries and borders and everything between sort of state and tribal land. And one of the advocates we spoke to, Krista Hareen Graber, said that who can respond to what crime? Tribal communities are a checkerboard with our state communities. In some places, you can run across the street and be in a different jurisdiction. So it makes it incredibly complicated when you have tribal police officers and state police officers show up at the scene of the crime. And we've had advocates say that they've had police officers arguing with each other about which jurisdiction they're in, while they have a survivor who's right there, who just wants to file a police report so she can seek justice against her perpetrator. So it makes it incredibly complicated, not only for police, but also for the prosecution's process, because it's not always immediately clear if the case should be prosecuted by a tribal prosecutor, a federal prosecutor, or a state prosecutor. So this is that maze that we're talking about, that women, that Indigenous women survivors have to go through, because, you know, they're taking one turn, they're trying to figure out like, which police office am I even supposed to be going to? Am I even going to be able to get this case prosecuted? It can be very difficult and very complicated for a survivor who's just survived a traumatic event, and then they're sort of faced with all of these issues immediately after surviving an assault. So that's a little bit about the maze. And I'm also going to tell you about some of the issues in policing. So I referenced some of them already, with, you know, police showing up at the scene of the crime, and it's difficult to tell, you know, what the jurisdiction is. But really for police officers, there can be a lack of resources for tribal police in Indian country. If there are interagency agreements between police departments, sometimes there's really poor coordination between offices, poor investigative responses. All of these things have had a pretty negative impact on women after they survive sexual violence. And as you can see here, so the ratio for law enforcement in Indian country versus the national average, there's one officer per 524 people in Indian country and one officer per 286 people nationally. So police officers in Indian country are spread quite thinly. And in the state of Alaska, which is a very, very unique place when it comes to law enforcement. There are currently 75 Alaskan Native villages that have no law enforcement presence at all. And this creates a lot of issues for women, Indigenous women who survive sexual violence, because they might be in a very geographically isolated village with their perpetrator. And if they have, you know, cell access or internet access, and they're able to contact a police officer in another village or in another part of the state, they would have to, you know, oftentimes they'd have to take a plane to get to that isolated village. But it's Alaska, so it snows a lot in the winter. So if the weather's bad, they might not be able to fly out to the village. So you have just like a plethora of problems that can arise for a survivor, and she's still in the village with the person who assaulted her oftentimes. So again, just a whole host of problems. And in the report, there is like an Alaska box section that just shows the very unique challenges just in the state of Alaska for a number of reasons. And to tell you again about some of the issues with policing when women go missing, which is also very common with missing and murdered Indigenous women, or if a woman is sexually assaulted. An advocate we spoke to, Jusqua, said that when someone goes missing, you go to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but they say, oh, she was living down in town, you have to go to the city police. So you go to the city police and they say, oh, she's actually living out at her cousin's in another county, you have to go there. And you go there, but she's tribally enrolled, and the town says, oh, she's tribally enrolled, that's a tribe issue. So now you have 3 half-finished reports on a missing girl when every minute counts. So again, this is just sort of another branch of the maze, is that many women or advocates who are trying to find women or help women after they're assaulted, they get kicked around between different offices, and the people in those offices don't even know where people should be going. So again, just many different issues when it comes to policing in Indian country as well. So after a woman contacts the police, files a police report, or even if she does not even want to go to the police, many survivors, if not, all survivors of sexual violence, are encouraged to seek a sexual assault exam, a post-sexual assault exam, also known as a rape kit. But a lot of Native women are unable to have, sort of timely and adequate access to rape kits because the Indian Health Service, the IHS, is severely underfunded. The IHS is also very understaffed. There's just not very competitive pay or benefits in the Indian Health Service hospital system. There's really a lack of oversight for the provision of rape kits. And again, there's this issue of geographical isolation for some women living on reservations or in very isolated villages. And as you can see from the statistic, only 30.7% of Native lands are within a 60-minute driving distance of sexual assault examination services. So say if a woman doesn't have a car, it can be very difficult for her to access these services, again, if she's in a very isolated part of the country. And many women prefer to go to Native healthcare providers like the IHS or other clinics when they survive an assault. But again, sometimes the IHS, they aren't able to access these hospitals because, a lot of them are closed on the weekend. I think a lot of them have like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. hours. So what is a woman supposed to do when it's 2 a.m., after she's survived an assault and all she wants to do is, get the exam over with and to collect that evidence if she wants to pursue a prosecution further down the line. So again, just a lot of sort of issues compounding each other. And they also, many women fear discrimination at non-Native health centers because, as one advocate told us, when a woman faces sort of racist treatment or discriminatory treatment at a non-Native health center, word gets out, and then women aren't going to want to go back to that hospital after because they don't want to be treated the same way that she was treated. So quite a few issues with the healthcare and also in the IHS system that we have heard from the advocates that we spoke to. So getting back to the aspect of prosecution, so tribal justice systems aren't really able to effectively respond to crimes on their own just because they've been so restricted by the federal government. And they have had so many limitations placed on their tribal authority by the government. There are also very high declination rates for cases of sexual assault in Indian country, and this is often because of insufficient evidence, which goes back to what we were just talking about, rape kit access. So many women are not able to access a rape kit after they are assaulted, and then this becomes a huge issue when they want their case to be prosecuted because if they don't have some evidence like a rape kit, it makes it extremely difficult to prosecute the case because prosecutors are going to say, we don't have a really solid case here without that sort of evidence. And in 2019, the insufficient evidence category made up 79% of cases declined. So again, it is a major issue when a woman isn't able to access a rape kit, because that can be a huge part or huge issue with the prosecutions process as well. There's also very poor funding for U.S. attorneys' offices in Indian country. So since 2013, funding for U.S. attorneys' offices has decreased 40% for offices in Indian country, as I mentioned. So I'm sure at this point, you're probably thinking, so what do we do now? Or like, what can I do? So to tell you a little bit about the recommendations in the report, the recommendations are very long. There are a lot of them. A lot of them are very complicated and address some of the laws that have been implemented in the US over the past 100 years or so. So now we're really looking at recommendations that are centered around restoring jurisdiction for tribes. But that is something that could take decades or 50 years. I hope it's something I can see in my lifetime. So we're figuring out what would make a change in people's lives sort of quickly or in the more immediate future. So again, some of the recommendations boiled down for like law enforcement. They should be able to effectively investigate crimes of sexual violence and be trained to do so and be culturally competent and be able to communicate effectively with Indigenous communities where they are working. The Indian Health Service should make sure that survivors have access to sexual assault exam services whenever they need them. And prosecutors should be sufficiently resourced to make sure that all cases are treated with urgency and prosecuted without delay. And then it's sort of, you know, for the things that people in the group could do, I would say become engaged and stay engaged just by being here and having like the sneak preview of the report essentially and learning more about the issue, learning more about what AIUSA is doing. This is already a great first step. So thank you for coming and learning about this. And then I would say like sharing the report when it comes out in May and send it to legislators in your state, send it to your friends in other states, have them share it with their legislators. And also the launch date, we're looking at around May 9th. So early to mid-May, I would say, but that's not, you know, set in stone. And then after the report is launched in mid-May, I would definitely say check out the page on AIUSA's website with more details. So we will be launching a new web page with the report in mid-May that'll provide, you know, a PDF file of the report so it's easily accessible. And we will also be adding sort of more resources and action items for activists across the country with a list of things that they can do and how they can reach out to their legislators or how to share the report or other actions they can take to raise awareness on this topic. So that is kind of the bulk of what I had. So that's really the presentation. If you have any questions for me, I would be more than happy to answer them. So yeah.
She wanted to set a marker for other coaches so that they could say, hey, if I'm close to achieving that,
And you can say if you want to ask your questions out loud, or if you prefer to write them in the chat, that is also perfectly fine. I'm fine with either option.
Jane, I have a question.
Yes. Was it Jennifer who said that?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, hi.
Did you mean to, would that be our Texas state legislators, or
Yes.
you're talking about our senators and representatives to the U.S. Congress?
Senators and representatives. Sorry, I should have clarified that. Yes, senators.
Okay. I think Irma wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, Irma, do you have a question?
Well, I was just curious. I mean, I know it's a problem, but what population are we talking about? I mean, I guess I'm not very up on where Indian reservations are. I know we had some out in California. We used to live in San Diego, but I just, you know, they're not. I mean, they don't get a lot of publicity, so it's hard to get awareness for them, I'm sure. I mean, how many Native American women are there? I guess that's one question.
That's a great question. I actually don't know the exact number of the population in the United States. I know that there are, I believe, 574 federally recognized tribes that are all across the United States. I could definitely share that list with the group as well after the meeting tonight. I'd be more than happy to send that. But we're sort of talking about tribes, I mean, essentially in every state. Really, it's not just specifically like in one area. I mentioned the state of Alaska specifically just because they have a very unique set of problems when it comes to addressing sexual violence. And also, I think the state of Alaska still has the highest rate of sexual violence out of any state in the United States still. So that is why I mentioned it specifically. But in general, the report is very broadly talking about just all the states, all the tribes across the United States.
Okay, thank you.
Is this violence mostly Indian on Indian, or is it, it's, you know, like white on Indian? How does this, you know, how does that work out?
So like the statistical breakdown of like perpetrators of the violence.
Mhm.
So it's really a combination of both. It depends on the demographics as well of the area. Like in the state of Alaska, you'll see that there are more Native perpetrators because, you know, you have these more closed off Native villages. There are more sort of Native people than say like Native and white people, with white people perpetrating the violence against Native people, if that makes sense. So, but there, I think a majority of Native women who have been sexually assaulted, at least one of the perpetrators, if there have been multiple assaults, at least one has been white. So there are extremely high rates of white perpetrators assaulting Native women. But it's definitely a mix of both, depending on the demographics of the area where the women are living. So it really depends on the state, really.
I had a question about jurisdiction issues.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of cooperation across that have solved that issue? I was thinking along the lines of the drug task force. So in the city, it's like I'm in San Diego. In the city, the police, the federal DOJ provides grants for local law enforcement to put together these drug task force with the city, county, and state and federal law enforcement all get together and coordinate stuff, activities. I was wondering that something like that could work for these Native American issues.
Yeah, so there are some, I mean, I think from what you're getting, like, or what you were trying to say and what I'm getting from that, there are sort of like interagency cooperation between, I believe, tribal police officers and also state police officers, and they try to work together. And there are some agreements. I'm not quite sure what, you know, the details of those agreements are, but there are tribal police officers that work very closely with state police officers in order to tackle some of these issues. But there's usually some sort of very specific agreement to that area. And there's a very specific reason, you know, why they would say, like, in this spot exactly, we want to work together with state police to tackle X, Y, and Z issue. There are also, again, going back to the state of Alaska, there are also paraprofessional police officers as well who work with the state police officers. They don't have as many sort of I guess powers, I guess you could say, as state police officers, but they're people who live in a specific region of the state, and they can be like first responders when crimes take place. So they might not be able to arrest people in some cases, or they might not be able to arrest non-native people if they're a tribal police officer, but there's still people who can show up to the scene of the crime, take down information, and be there with someone who has survived an act of sexual violence. So there have been some unique solutions, essentially working with state police officers or with other forms of paraprofessional police officers to address the issue of sexual violence and that police response as well. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Hey, Louisa, you have a question. Can you unmute and ask?
Yeah, my question, I'm trying to unmute, but
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Sorry.
I can hear you loud and clear.
My little door was closed, sorry. No, my question is kind of more general. If there was any evidence of educational or counseling for men in the tribal community, I mean, do you see any examples of that? We've talked to other folks in the past who said, you know, in certain kinds of communities, there was evidence of that sort of counseling intervention stuff going on. So that would be the first question. Now, my second part is, you know, a lot of metropolitan areas and some, you know, smaller and mid-sized towns across the U.S. have women's centers where there's a, you know, there's a place for women to go to be protected if they feel like they're in, you know, in likely to be the victim of violence or rape or whatever. I just wondered if there was any evidence or examples of that kind of support for people.
Yeah, of course. So I'll start with your second question. So yes, there are definitely Native-led centers and shelters specifically for Native women, like I want to say it's the Tundra Women's Coalition or the Eminok Women's Shelter. We spoke to some of the advocates who lead those shelters specifically for Indigenous women. So yes, they definitely do exist. There are also Native-led like hotlines for Indigenous survivors. So the Strong Hearts Native Helpline is one example of that. And it's specifically for Indigenous women. When they're sexually assaulted, they can call the hotline and then they can speak to somebody on the other end that can help them to find other Native-led health services so they can get post-rape care. And those have shown to be extremely effective, and Indigenous women very strongly prefer going to Indigenous-led services. So yes, it does exist, and they are specific to Indigenous women, and then they are in more isolated areas as well. And then could you repeat your first question? Sorry, I forgot it.
Yeah, the first part was just, I mean, you know, that it's been such a compelling, horrible problem for so long. Is there any evidence or any examples of men being educated or addressed or what with respect to the treatment of what, you know, of the situation and the violence and the.
Yeah, that's something we actually, I mean, that's something that I discussed with my supervisors. We were working on this report. That's a topic that came up, but we don't actually get into that for this report just because we were already focusing on like so many different issues. We had to narrow it down as much as possible. So we were thinking of adding a portion on education and working, especially for like men who've been survivors of sexual assault as well. But essentially it was just a little too outside of the scope of what we were focusing on. This report originally was actually supposed to be just on the Indian Health Service and rape kit access, and it kind of grew from there into a full-fledged update to the 2007 report. But in short, after that ramble, I would say no, we really don't sort of delve into that. But I do know that there are education programs specifically for men. I just can't think of the names of them off the top of my head. And it's more sort of like tribe to tribe. It's not like there's one big general program that I can think of.
There are programs for date rape in the high school, in some high schools, in some states.
Okay. Like Indigenous specific or just like in general?
But not yeah, I don't know
Gotcha.
anything about Indigenous, but yeah, that could, I don't know how widespread that is.
Yeah.
Where I taught in high school, they had classes on date rape, and that included the men, you know, young men and young women together.
Yeah.
Do you know of any particular congressional members or government entities who are working towards trying to get the funding reinstated or enhanced? Or do you just in your research, do you know of any legislators who might be receptive to being contacted by folks like us who would be concerned about government funding?
Yeah, that is a great question for specific senators. So God, I'm trying to think. So I know that regarding funding or increases in funding, I'm not sure if everyone here heard that the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized this year. So there has been funding for tribal programs. It has also expanded jurisdiction over crimes of sexual violence in Indian country. So there's actually been kind of a big step forward when it comes to prosecuting non-Indian offenders of sexual violence against Indigenous women in Indian country. So there has been funding allocated specifically for those programs. There's been an increase, but when it comes to specific legislators, again, that is a great question that I'm going to write down because again, we're still working the main say advocacy ask or advocacy plan for the report when it is launched. So we're still essentially developing the list of who we're going to contact, who we're going to reach out to. So we do not currently have that. But again, I'd be more than happy to send an email out to everyone in the group once I sort of figure that out and have that planned out for you as well. So you can start sending some letters and contacting people, as we will surely be as well when the report launches.
Why did you differentiate between Alaskan and American Indian?
Oh, that's a great question. So a lot of people, so as you heard me say, I said American Indian, Alaska Native, AIAN, Indigenous, Indian. So a lot of people, people identify in very different ways, and people choose what is best to them. This is like a person-to-person thing. Like some people say I'm Indigenous, some people say I'm Native American, some people say I am Indian. It really depends on just what they feel most comfortable with or what fits their identity. And I actually don't know totally why Alaska Natives have such distinction in the titles that they use. Perhaps it's because the state of Alaska was, you know, incorporated into the United States so late. So culturally, perhaps it was because of the difference there, or, but I just know that we always have, we've been using that term or making that differentiation, you know, since the first Mays report that was put out. So.
My two oldest grandchildren are actually members of the Ute tribe. Their other grandmother managed to get them enrolled, even though they're technically not quite eligible. But I know they have an excellent hospital. The Utes have a lot of, they got mineral rights, so they're doing okay financially. But only Utes can go to the hospital. And I'm real curious. I'm going to investigate this and find out what sort, if they have any kind of facilities for women specifically.
No, I would be interested to hear that as well. Because
yeah, I'll let you know what I find out. Because
yeah,
I'm very curious now.
Yeah, it can really vary from hospital to hospital, clinic to clinic. Again, there's just very little, I would say what we found, there's very little consistency between all of the hospitals and the protocols that they follow, or the policies, or, you know, things like that. They're all very different. That's what we've learned. So varying levels of care for sure.
Hey, Don, can you go ahead and ask your question? You typed it in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see a question in the chat, sorry.
Yeah, the last one, it said, do you work with NSVRC?
NSVRC?
It's
It's the National Sexual Violence Resource Center.
They publish a lot of statistics relative to the U.S. I don't know who else they work with. Before the program, I had looked up some things. They're the ones that collect a lot of statistics and report that 20% of the women in the U.S. experience sexual violence. And about the same for men. That nationwide, 81% of women are reporting some sort of sexual harassment. So it's and then there's statistics, just a lot of statistics. They're and I forget who they're connected with, but they're a National Resource Center for Statistics.
I'll definitely check them out. I'll let you all know that for the report, a lot of the statistics that we used were from the National Institute of Justice, which is a research institute under the Department of Justice. And in 2016, Andre Rose released a report on violence against Indigenous women. So it talks about, again, just any form of violence against Indigenous women, and then boiling down to sexual violence against Indigenous women. It's an incredible report. It's great. And it's racially disaggregated, which is kind of the biggest issue. Again, one of the biggest issues that we found when looking for statistics for this report, because a lot of Native American women, Indigenous women, are lumped into the other category in racially disaggregated data. So they'll be lumped in with sort of Asian American Pacific Islanders, Native American women, and then I think one other demographic, and they'll be put under the other category. So that was a huge issue for us when we were trying to find solid data for this report, because we can't use that because it brings in so many other populations into the same statistics. So just to give you a little insight, but I'll definitely check it out and see what statistics they have. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. But yeah, that just kind of brought up the fact that finding racially disaggregated data it's tricky. It's tricky.
It's a nonprofit. I thought it was government related, but it's a nonprofit organization for collecting and recording and managing data relative to sexual violence.
Perfect. I mean, this will also be incredibly helpful for other sort of bits of work that we do in the gender, sexuality, and identity program, because this is still relevant, if not just specifically for Indigenous women, for all women across the country, advocacy efforts. So thank you for sharing that.
It's a serious problem for Native American or Native Indian friends, American Indian friends, but also is really a very serious problem in our culture.
Yeah, it really is.
In general.
It is.
Anybody else have any questions?
I'd like to ask Jane a question.
Yeah, of course.
If I heard you correctly, you close to the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned a United Nations Declaration of Rights for Native Peoples.
Yeah. So Andrea,
you could expand on that. And one of my concerns is that something that nations sign on to, and has the United States signed in onto it?
Yes, so I can actually, if you'd like to have it, I can send it to you real quick in the chat so you can look at the text. I might not be able to send this to everybody. I think I can send this to Ruth, and she might be able to share the PDF with everybody. So let me see. Let me know if you were able to access that, Ruth, or maybe I can send it to Mohammed. Let me know if you were able to.
Oh, okay, I just got it.
Okay, perfect. So let me see if I can find this. So this is something I believe that countries can sign on to. So essentially in 2010, I want to say the US declared its support for UNDRIP. Barack Obama declared his support for it. Like, it's not legally binding, but the US has essentially said that it has like moral and political force. So it's really just kind of like a standard set of rights that countries should be shooting for, is kind of what I get from this. So again, not legally binding, but previous presidents have expressed their support for it in the United States. I haven't heard of like Joe Biden has voiced his support for it, not quite sure. But these are essentially a list of rights that countries or states should be trying to uphold for their Indigenous populations, because it's not just Indigenous peoples of the United States. It could be Indigenous peoples of Canada, of Mexico, in African nations, or in other parts of the world, essentially. So these are very broadly, and Indigenous is kind of the internationally accepted term. It's the one that I use the most, and we use Indigenous in the title of the report. So sorry, kind of sidetracked there on the word Indigenous, but there's the link to the list of rights as well, if you'd like to take a look at it. It is a very interesting document.
Yeah, I just pulled it up. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Anybody else have any questions? Okay. All right, I'll have one. Oh, Aziz, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Hi, Aziz.
Or are you leaving?
No, I have no question. Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead. All right, so Jen, I have a question. So our Secretary of Department of Interior, Deb Haaland, is a Native American. So since she became the secretary, has she brought in any changes from the federal level that will alleviate some of these issues that you have identified here?
We really don't reference anything that she has done specifically. I believe she's voiced her support for the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, but other than that, I'm not aware of any specific actions that she has taken that would help alleviate some of these problems, or what her sort of specific take would be on some of these issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else?
I had a question about when you come out with your report, is there a campaign and actions that are going to go along with that?
Yes. So this is what I was discussing a little bit at the very end of the report. So we're still building out the main advocacy asks. Spoiler alert. So the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization that I've referenced several times, that has increased funding, expanded jurisdiction, et cetera, that was going to be the main ask of our report. And it's already been authorized. So we were super excited because we're like, great, because it was supposed to be reauthorized 3 years ago, but it's been stalled for several years. So that was our big ask, and it passed. So we don't have to ask for it anymore. So we're still working on that action plan. And again, as I said, like when we launch the website, we'll have the list of things that activists across the country can do. It's just that we're still building out our list of advocacy asks right now, because we had to restructure many things in the report in the past 2 weeks. And so we've had to totally restructure our advocacy plan as well. So I'm definitely thinking on our feet, but we will have a list of recommendations and things that other advocates or activists can do once the report comes out in May.
Awesome.
Right.
Wish I had a better answer for you right now. Really wish I did, but we will.
So how will we know when the report is released? Do we just check the website, AIUSA website on May 9th and see if it's there, or?
I mean, I would be more than happy to contact you directly and let you know what the release date is, especially because, I mean, I'm so happy that your group was interested in learning more about the report. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you as well, and being here and taking your questions. So I will definitely message your group to let you know when the release date is set in stone. And then in general, for other groups in the US, will put out a press release, I believe, right before it comes out or right when it comes out. And so that's how everyone else will kind of hear about it. This is my first time. I haven't been with Amnesty for that long. I started working with AIUSA in July, fresh out of grad school. So I haven't been part of the report release process, but my understanding is that there will be a big press release, and then the report will magically appear in a PDF file on the website. So I think that's how it usually goes. But I would definitely be more than happy to email you and let you know when it's coming out as well, just so you aren't guessing. So.
Yeah. All right. So, Jen, thank you so much for taking time and speaking at our event, our monthly meeting. This was really very, very eye-opening, and we can't wait for, at least I personally cannot wait for the report to come out. Ruth, you have your hand up? Oh, you're clapping.
No, it's the clap.
Oh,
Clapping.
okay, folks. So our next meeting is on Monday, May 2nd, same time, 6:15 p.m. And the topic for the May meeting is human trafficking. As you know, Houston is considered the capital for human trafficking. So there's an organization stationed right here called United Against Human Trafficking, and the education coordinator from there, Sarah Brewer, she will be speaking about the human trafficking status here in Houston, and what we can do as a group to help the victims and as do some advocacy work, and whatever we can do from our local group here. So we always meet on the first Monday of the month at 6:15 p.m. Central Time. And Bob, do you have anything to add?
Nope, not a thing. I'm
And
just looking forward to the report.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for having me. It was such a pleasure. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.